that this is part of growth. We are becoming enlightened. We are becoming aware. Be strong. Be in your heart. Be of vision. Do not be afraid. And I will see you somewhere, sometime. I wish you well.
Beautiful, beautiful tune from S-Man there. Tonight's show is going to be an absolute cracker. We've got an hour from the Reverend Kevin Annette, and after that hour we'll have Santos Bonacci. But I'm going to kick straight in, as we've only got an hour with Kevin tonight. And basically the Pope quit this week, and there is a lot of rumours flying about of what the Pope has been up to and what is going on in the world. So welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
No problem. Would you like to explain, first of all, promote your website where all the information is? It's ITCCS.org. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah, and this is where all the information is that you're holding about genocide in Canada and the connections to that, to the Vatican and the Pope quitting. So could you go into more detail, please?
Well, also the other evidence is up online at a second website, hiddennolonger.com. That's got all of the stuff that we base this on in terms of the work in Canada. But the first site, ITCCS, is the Tribune website, and it does have a lot of the recent stuff concerning the Pope. And in a nutshell, what happened, and for people who are tuning in for the first time, on February 4th, a European government sent to the Secretary of State's office a diplomatic note saying that they were beginning the process of a case against Joseph Ratzinger in which arrest warrants would be issued if he came into their territory. Now, in response, we believe in response, 6 days later, Ratzinger resigned, which was unprecedented. Popes have resigned before, but never in this way, never in times of peace, never just before Easter. It was the quickest, really, expulsion of somebody from that office in history. And
Kevin, who served these arrest warrants? Was it the Canadian government or?
No, it was a European government. They're in negotiations right now with the Vatican Secretary of State's office, so they don't want to go public yet. They will disclose all this stuff in time, though. But it wasn't an actual arrest warrant. It was what they call a diplomatic note, basically informing one country that they were starting this and asking for their cooperation in basically not harboring a suspected criminal, which is what Joseph Ratzinger is. And so, in the wake of that, not only did he resign, but then he did a very odd thing, which is go to the Italian president for help, which he doesn't even have to do under the Lateran Treaty. That help is already assured. So it was a very panicked reaction. And the most recent thing where the Vatican even announced that they were giving him sanctuary now, it's mind-boggling, because he's going to be a private German citizen, and yet he'll be also a wanted felon hiding out in the Vatican. So it's making a lot of problems for them long term, and it's a very mixed up kind of response. I think they're really in panic mode right now.
So since the Pope, i.e. Joseph Ratzinger, has quit, he will remain a permanent resident of the Vatican, and doing so will give him immunity. Is that correct?
Well, they think it'll give him immunity, but it doesn't actually. Under international law, the Vatican is not actually a state. It's a convenience that governments grant to them, but they don't have any of the characteristics of a state under international law. And anyone could be extradited from the Vatican if a government or international courts apply enough pressure. That's really the issue. Not that it can happen, but will it?
We just lost our...
I'm back.
Okay,
I'm back.
carry on,
What happened there? Are you still here, Kevin? I just missed that. So can you repeat it for me, please?
Well, I was just saying that the Vatican is not actually a state under international law. It's just a convenient arrangement they have with the Italian government and other countries. But anyone in there can be extradited. It's a question of whether governments are going to take that step. And the only way that'll happen is if enough pressure is put on them. And that's very much what's going on these days.
Because I understand the Vatican's much like the City of London or Washington, D.C. It's its own foreign jurisdiction hiding away in the middle of a country.
Well, there's a book written called The Case of the Pope by an English Queen's Counsel, actually. And people should look it up because in there he refers to under the law, international law, the Vatican is what he calls a Santa Claus state, where, it's this myth that people like to perpetuate, but it has no bearing. It has no standing as a government, actually. And, because of that, the Italian government tomorrow could revoke their whole protection. But they don't, of course, because of political reasons and financial reasons. They're endowed directly. Every political party in Italy receives money from the Vatican. That's been established. We're going to actually print those documents during the next few weeks.
Okay, so it says on your website, his continued presence, and this is a quote, his continued presence in the Vatican is necessary, otherwise he might be defenseless. Who said this, and in what context was it?
That was a Vatican spokesman. I think it was one of their PR guys. It wasn't a cardinal. It was just one of their flunkies giving their press release. But it's really an amazing statement. It's such an admission of guilt. I mean, if he was innocent, why wouldn't he just answer these charges? Why wouldn't he be willing to stand in the light of day? The reality is he signed letters ordering bishops in America, Germany, elsewhere to cover up and protect child rapists. That, under international law, is called international obstruction of justice, where you're telling people, citizens of other countries, to break the laws of their own countries. Very serious crime under international law, and he knows it. An American lawyer called Jonathan Levy even has copies of these letters he signed. He's been trying to issue extradition requests to the Italian government, but they keep getting ignored. So, I mean, they have the goods on this guy, and they know it. He wouldn't be hiding out unless he knew of his guilt.
So how have they been told to hide paedophilia? Is this written in their canon law?
Yes. It isn't just acts of random priests or occasional letters from the Pope. It's an actual law that Ratzinger helped to write. It's called Crimen Solicitanus. You can actually see a whole copy of this law at our website, hiddennolonger.com, right in the appendix there, one of the appendices. Crimen Solicitanus was composed mostly by Joseph Ratzinger when he was a priest for Vatican II, the conference in 1962. In that year, it became adopted as official policy. And what it says is that in paragraph 11, when a child is harmed or any act of what they call bestiality occurs, child rape, whatever, the victim is to be silenced. The perpetrator is to be silenced and under what they call the pontifical secret. And the local priest and bishop are to cover it up and not tell the police. And if they do disclose what happened, they're excommunicated. So, in fact, it's a conspiracy involving every Catholic clergy on the planet. And that document in itself is grounds to indict the entire Vatican leadership for crimes against humanity.
So, is it right that the ITCCS filed for criminal prosecution?
We provided the evidence upon which the court in this country acted. So it isn't our body directly, but we were an integral part of the whole thing.
Okay, so how did the ITCCS file for criminal prosecution, and what was the actual charges that was put in there?
Well, two charges, and now, just so people know, we presented an entire case in the first docket in our court, which is Genocide in Canada. It's up at itccs.org on November 6th and January 30th. Just check those postings. There's over 150 exhibits there, including the role of the Vatican, setting up these Indian schools in covering up crimes, etc. So what we did is we submitted this as a package of evidence to jurists in a number of countries in Europe, and this one country acted on it, and they, on the basis of that, they filed a suit. Now, in other words, we're acting as a legal resource, but also we're doing more than that. We're also trying to activate the citizenry, saying under common law, when the authorities do not protect our children, we have the obligation and the right to do that. And so we're also evoking what's perfectly legal under common law, which is a de jure court to rule on these matters. There's 58 citizen jurors weighing the evidence. And this is their verdict will have what's called jurisdictional competence. That is, it's recognized in other courts that when, for example, the Canadian courts refuse to rule on genocide, these courts can. So that's also the basis on which we're acting.
Would you like to go into a little bit more detail how the Vatican is connected to the genocide in Canada and what actually happened to the Indigenous people of Canada?
Sure. The Indian boarding schools were set up under a Jesuit plan, started in the 1860s by a guy called Bishop Paul Duryea. The Jesuits had a model all over the world going back to the 16th century where they would go into a native, like non-Catholic area, destroy the traditional leaders either by killing them, driving them away, replace them with converted Catholic chiefs, and then set up a system in their villages called the Watchmen where people would spy on each other. And that created the model for the Indian boarding school system in both the United States and Canada. You know, they also had similar systems. The British set up a similar model in the Scottish Highlands after the clearances, where they, you know, that's why my ancestors came to Canada. We were driven out and the Gaelic language was banned. The traditions were banned. They used that as a model, but it was very much inspired by this Jesuit system. And under that, 2/3 of the schools were run by the Catholics. Over half the children died. Over 50,000 children never came back. Even the governments have admitted those statistics now. And a lot of that, like I say, is published at hiddennolonger.com. There were letters from Catholic bishops as recently as the 1980s ordering that the evidence of mass graves near the school be concealed, that evidence be destroyed. The death rate was that high the very first year one of these Catholic schools opened in 1891 in Western Canada. So clearly, it was a plan to exterminate large areas of the country of natives under the guise of religion. You know, and they often did it by taking children who were sick with tuberculosis and deliberately housing them with the healthy. We even have letters of government Indian agents and doctors describing that practice, but they did nothing about it. That went on for over a century. So it's pretty conclusive evidence. You know, especially now that the government has acknowledged a lot of this stuff, but they're not prosecuting any of the churches for it.
So you've got all sorts of law out there to deal with matters like this, everything from statutes and acts to common law, and then you've got international law and canon law. Could you explain to people what canon law actually is and how it seems to supersede all other laws by actually covering up these evil crimes of paedophilia?
Well, you know, it's kind of a long history, and in England you had, you know, an example of that during Henry II's time, where he fought the Pope over what court would have jurisdiction over clergy. And after his friend, it's kind of a story. I won't get into the thing about the murder of Thomas Becket and all that, but basically there was a modus operandi worked out over 1,000 years ago between church and state in Europe, and it said that the church would have jurisdiction over its own clergy, over everything that went on within the church, and over things like the universities and large areas of Europe. That, you know, they gradually succeeded that control over the centuries, but what's still acknowledged by governments is that the church is a law unto itself, and anything that occurs within the church, no so-called secular court has access to. So in effect, a priest can rape a child, they can even kill children, and no civil court can do anything about it unless the church wants to cooperate. So occasionally the church will toss one of their child-raping priests to the sharks as a gesture, but the institution itself is outside civil law. And I had an example of that when I was thrown out of the United Church, and now that's a Protestant church in Canada. No court would intervene in what they were doing. They even have letters from the Attorney General of British Columbia saying they can't do anything about it. It's an internal church matter. So in effect, we have two systems of law. And as long as that carries on, you're going to get these crimes because it's a haven for every child rapist, for anyone who knows they can evade justice.
Yeah, it seems to me that the Vatican and the Crown are very high up on this pyramid of elites. But who's controlling them? Who's above the Vatican?
Well, I think financially, the Vatican Bank, since often you follow the money and you find out, an answer to your question. But if on the financial level, it's hard to know because the Vatican Bank is a completely secret society. It can't ever be audited. Its records are destroyed every 5 years. You can't know who the directors are. But we know it launders an incredible amount of money for the mafia, for dictatorships all over the world. And, of course, they're tied into very high players, within the European system, the Knights of Malta are an example of their links. I mean, every president of the United States, every director of the CIA, corporate heads, even Nelson Mandela, they're all Knights of Malta. And so, I mean, you can see that the traces of this system. We do know that the Vatican Bank, and especially the Jesuits, are heavily invested in big pharma and the arms industry. They own major banks in America. So, they are tied in definitely with the financial elites of the world. Politically and in other ways, I would say they are also more than what they seem. For example, we found evidence that a lot of Saudi oil and Chinese investment is connected with holding companies owned by the Vatican. And so, it takes a lot of research, and we don't have a definitive answer, but I would say they're definitely up there in terms of these players,
Yeah, for sure. So what do you think is going to come of all this criminal filing and all these charges that are being thrown over there? Do you think anything will actually come of it and there'll be arrests?
It's already happening. I mean, the church wouldn't be reacting in such a defensive manner unless their power was really under attack. And there's two things that I think are going to go on. Within the hierarchy, you're going to see a circling of the wagons, a complete shutdown of any more information leaks. They're going to put in a very conservative establishment, Italian, probably Bertone himself might be Pope. They're not going to risk any kind of change right now. But on the broader front, I very much believe that arrests are possible because anywhere in the world outside the Vatican, these Catholic priests are vulnerable for arrest and prosecution. Every Catholic church in the world is maintained by public tax money. That means that under the law, any citizen has the right to go into there. It's a public institution. It's not a private one. So, for example, people in Italy and Ireland and other places are talking about occupying churches, as we've done here in Canada. We have every right to do that and take back that property because under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, Section 25, citizens have an obligation not to fund or support institutions that have committed crimes against humanity, like in this case, the Catholic Church. So you have the right to say, I'm not paying taxes to the government. We're not only not funding these churches, but we're taking back this illicitly accumulated wealth. And that's why people are talking about going into churches and camping out and opening them up to the homeless and people who need that property. All of those things are possible, and that is going to erode the power of the Vatican at its source. And, when we occupied these churches with Native people over the last few years in Canada, one thing we learned right away is that it doesn't matter how powerful they seem to be. These churches are very worried about the tax on their revenue and a tax on their public image. That's where they're most vulnerable. Within a day of us doing that occupation, the government of Canada had announced their apology about the residential schools, and the local bishops were calling us, pleading us not to occupy any more of their churches. I mean, this is an obvious sign, and of where they're weak. And I think it's really building into a big tsunami.
What do you actually mean by occupying the churches?
Well, going in and declaring. People do this in a number of ways. I'll give you an example. First of all, in the Indigenous territories in Canada, especially out west, Native people have actually gone on into local Catholic churches and evicted the priest and said, "You never signed a treaty with us. This is squatting on our land. Get out." And that's in fact happened. They have vacated the premises, and the local tribe has taken over the church building. That happened on the number of Cree reservations in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and we've documented some of that. But in the non-Native community, we've even been successful at that because we found, for example, that Canadian tax money was being used to directly subsidize the Catholic Church. And so we went in there, and we went in with about 50 people one day into the main cathedral in Vancouver. And we just squatted. We said, this is sustained by our tax money. We want to have some answers as to where you buried all these kids who died in Catholic residential schools. We didn't leave the church. The police showed up and they were powerless. They said, they had no right to evict us from a public, as long as we weren't breaking anything and causing violence or disruption, we weren't committing a crime. So the police backed off. The church had to give in, and they began to, at that point, do a lot of damage control so it wouldn't happen again. It's kind of a long story, but that's the kind of direct action. And, we've made appeals to people in the Occupy movement to help us, but unfortunately there hasn't really been a big response because they're to some degree tied in with church funding and church support. So it's kind of interesting when you push the envelope on these things.
Well, it's very, very, very interesting, especially when you mention the Occupy movement, because what connection does St. Paul's Cathedral have to the Vatican?
Well, they're the Church of England, and of course the head of that is Queen Elizabeth. And under the Treaty of Verona in 1213, King John became a legal vassal of Pope Innocent right before Magna Carta, and that was never annulled by any of the subsequent laws of the Crown of England. So we believe that the Crown is a vassal of Rome, and the fact that Queen Elizabeth is going to Rome on March 6th, even before the new Pope was in, to me is very interesting. I think that there is a direct tie there. So St. Paul's, it's kind of the flagship of the Church of England. And the fact that they were supporting Occupy to me was very interesting, because elsewhere, we actually showed that the Archbishop of Canterbury wrote to the head Anglican bishop in Canada just last year, ordering him to cover up all of the evidence of children murdered at the Anglican schools in Canada. It was a direct order to cover up and obstruct justice. Because this last year, we began to actually do digs at one of the oldest Church of England Indian schools in Canada. We began to find remains of children buried in that mass grave. That's when the hush order came from the Archbishop of Canterbury. So these guys are directly implicated, as is the Queen, in these crimes.
Now, when I was down at the St. Paul's protest of Occupy, I ended up having some very interesting communications with very high police, even with the Dean himself before he quit. And what happened down at St. Paul's was they closed St. Paul's down for the first time since World War II. And the reasons that they closed it down, that they were telling everybody publicly, was health and safety regulations. The fire service had told them that all these tents outside, a flame could go up and then they could all catch fire, blah, 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 and all this stuff. So I went over to the chapter house with a solicitor, and we knocked on the door. He went in, and we went and asked a few questions. Now, I used to have a spy camera at the time, and we caught the Dean on camera actually saying, "Get out, you're costing the church thousands." Now, St. Paul's Cathedral is it's held in trust. It's the St. Paul's Foundation, and it's got a board of trustees, and the Dean was on the board of trustees. Now, if it's held in trust for the people, then there's a serious breach of trust, because the church is opened up and it's there, and they're closing it for monetary reasons. So I went over to the chief inspector and I said to him, I suggest that you go and arrest the Dean. And he said, whatever for? And I said, well, there's been a serious breach of trust. He's closed the church down for monetary reasons. And he went, no, he's closed it for health and safety. And I said, well, I've got video evidence stating that he's closed it down, and he said that we're all costing him thousands, therefore it's a breach of trust. And the chief inspector said, I'm not going to arrest him. And I said, well, I may need your help when I arrest him then. And a couple of days later, he quit anyway. So it's like with St. Paul's, was you going to say something, Kevin?
No, go ahead. I'm just laughing.
All right. With St. Paul's, I was down there pretty damn active, but I was nothing to do with St. Paul's and the Occupy movement. I was down there because of certain information that came to me about St. Paul's being orchestrated and infiltrated very heavily by government bodies. Everything from the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations were running workshops. You had Saskia Kent, who's a common purpose graduate, running the General Assemblies. You had all the donation money was going to Climate Camp. You had a guy who runs a firm instructing the High Court bailiffs, running the security team down there. And it just seemed that every stone that you overturned down at Occupy seemed to be government running this leaderless movement. So it made me question it very highly. So what's your take on all that?
Well, it sounds like classic controlled opposition. There's a movement in Canada here called the Idle No More movement. It kind of sprung up, You might have read about it. Totally government funded and controlled. It isn't unusual, and the information people have about George Soros's funding of Occupy Wall Street, how this whole thing got funded or started. It's what you do in a time of crisis. It's a way to channel dissent and make sure that people are being all guided down the same route while they think they're challenging the system. In fact, they're not. But at the same time, I don't want to totally discourage people involved in that. There's a lot of good people working at the base. It's kind of like what I say about people in the churches. Yeah, you may not all be involved in the crime. You may not all be aware of this, but the fact of where you put your energy and money does help the crime. And people have to wake up to what they're part of and ask some hard questions, starting with, where is the money coming from? Who's making the decisions? Where's the accountability?
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. I met many great people when I was down at Occupy, but that they were... Can you put your mute on mic when you're not speaking, Kevin, because it echoes back a little bit?
Sorry about that.
That's all right, mate. But what I saw at Occupy was many great people coming together. And the way I see this, especially with people like the Tavistock Institute's involvement, is they want to manipulate a revolution or a movement because they know that there's an uprising about to happen. So they want to control it from within. They want to run the whole show.
Right. Well, I mean, that's just standard ops for these people. But I think, what we're finding is it's a target they can lose control of quite easily because with the level of communication now through the internet, through shows like this, people learn very quickly. I remember back in the 70s when we got involved in politics, and radical movement politics, people took days and weeks and months to become aware of something because there wasn't the means to find out. But now we can rely on this. And, that's certainly helped what we're doing.
So what do you think the solutions are to, if we stick on the subject of the Vatican and what's going on there, what do you personally think the solutions are?
Well, this isn't really, as much as we're focusing right now on Ratzinger because his guilt is so obvious. He's the thin edge of the wedge. And the issue isn't the figurehead, it's the institution and what's created that. We need long-term changes. We've got to overturn this whole system we live under because, the Vatican isn't any separate from this whole corporate domination of the planet that's threatening our liberties and our children and our very planet itself. And so one of the ways we want to do this in terms of the church is we've got a whole program we developed, which is at ITCCS.org if you want to look at it. One of the things that we've worked with groups in other countries in developing is kind of a long-term perspective on this. So, for example, we want to have all the tax exemptions for these churches annulled right off. We want their property and assets seized. We want to have clergy licensed as public servants so that if they harm a child, they lose their license, they can't practice. We can't have one set of laws for the church and another for everybody else. So we need these fundamental structural changes. And that happens through many different levels. We're not kind of cutting off any one area of working through. But ultimately, we realize that it's only by having citizenry who are united, who are educated and willing to be public and very active about this over many years, that's how things change. We're talking about long-term revolution. And I don't mean that in a glib way. I mean changing the attitudes, the way we are, the way these institutions operate. Disestablishing the institutions that have caused genocide. That's definitely our perspective. And along the way, there's a lot of things that can be done to help that. And that's why, I am really positive looking at what's changed over the last 10 years with this. I know this is happening as we speak.
Well, the thing is, it's like the Vatican have got so much power and wealth. One thing I question is, how have they got all that power and wealth?
I'll tell you briefly, there's not only the money they bring in every year, they figure about $50 billion just from the collection plate. The tax exemptions they get, of course. But one of the main sources, besides all their corporate investments, which are incredible, I mean, they're into big pharma, the arms industry, it's everywhere, a lot of their investments. But one of the main ways they keep getting funded is through what's called financial concordats. These are secret agreements. A concordat is any treaty between Vatican and governments around the world. Financial concordats have been signed with over 121 countries, including England. And the U.S. and other countries. These financial concordats actually siphon taxpayers' money directly into the Vatican Bank, if you can believe it, without your knowledge, without your consent or anything. And Spain alone had 260 million euros sent to the Vatican Bank in 2010, without anyone's knowledge except a small cabal of politicians who, signed this concordat. So if people want to, you can contact your member of parliament and ask, well, where is the financial concordat agreement between Rome and British government, and see what they say.
Oh, I might be popping my head into St. Paul's Cathedral at some point soon and ask a few questions myself down there. What would you suggest if I went down to St. Paul's Cathedral and I wanted to do a little bit of digging about? What sort of questions could I ask?
Well, first about the financial concordat, and if they have any knowledge of that. You could also ask them about their position on the Treaty of Verona in 1213 and whether it's still legally binding on the Crown of England, since they are the Crown of England. You might also, and I can email you this information, we wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury asking him if it was true that he ordered a cover-up of the murder of Indian children at the Mohawk School in Brantford and the mass grave there. And that's the kind of question we need a direct answer from Church of England. So that would help a lot, because the Mohawk people I work with are very curious why that cover-up was ordered directly from London in January 2012.
So somebody's just posed a question. What is the connection to the Vatican and the Jesuits, if there is any?
Oh, there's a direct connection. Some people think that so-called Black Pope, he's called the Black Pope because of the black color of the Jesuit robe. Some say that he's the one calling the shots in Rome. I think there's some validity to that when you look at the political and financial power of the Jesuits. Of course, they were set up in the 1540s by Ignatius Loyola, who was a Spanish conquistador. And it was set up as a military society as the kind of assassination bureau for the Vatican. It's the fourth vow of the Jesuits, which is still in effect, gives any Jesuit the right under Vatican law to murder, torture, and destroy any opponent of the Pope. And by that, they included heads of state. They really led the Counter-Reformation in Europe. They tried to crush Protestantism, free-thinking humanism anywhere in the world. They have overthrown more governments than even the CIA have in human history. And, so they are really at the front line. They're kind of like the military wing of the Vatican. And they even have an assassination bureau. It's called the Holy Alliance. And they were probably responsible for the murder of John Paul I in 1978 when he started investigating the mob ties with the Vatican Bank. There's a good book about that people can read called In God's Name by David Yallop. He's pretty well documented that. So, they are a very nasty group of people. And they also, part of their job over the centuries was to set up universities to train the elites into Catholic thinking. And they've set up numerous universities all over the world, including Georgetown University, which is the main Washington, D.C. think tank for the government. So that's extensive. They own Citibank of America. We've got a whole list of their holdings.
So in the Bible, in many different types of Bible as well, that they'll say that Christ or Jesus is in every single one of us, and they worship or follow God or whatever. But I like to say I study the teachings of Jesus or the teachings of Christ. I don't follow anything, and we are all part of that godness. But who do the Catholics actually worship? Because it seems to me that they're Catholics that go to church and everything like that. They're either worshipping a statue or the Pope.
Well, that's bang on. As a matter of fact, I'm writing a book about this because there's a whole really interesting history where Catholicism really isn't a Christian tradition at all. It's a neo-pagan Roman cult, which doesn't, pay lip service to God and Christ because that was the culture at the time. But in fact, it has adopted the whole Roman way of thinking where the emperor was considered God. After the 3rd century, they brought in a term called Deus et Dominus, which means God and Master. And emperor was considered literally the transmission belt between heaven and earth. That's how the Pope is seen. He even carries the same title that the Roman emperor had, Pontifex Maximus, the great bridge between heaven and earth. So yes, very much the Pope is seen as God on earth. And if you read any statement out of the Vatican, and over the centuries, and including recently, they say the Pope can make no mistake because he's God. That's very clear that's how they view it. So I believe that's an apostasy. That's blasphemy if you're any kind of believing Christian to even go there. And that's why people really have to understand the history to know what they're dealing with.
If we move on to a point that I saw on ITCCS.org, is it you that's running the campaign on the 24th of March?
Well, we're a whole network of groups. I'm one of the public figureheads on this, but there's groups in 10 countries that are going to be launching these actions. And
what it states on the website is to force the extradition of Ratzinger from the Vatican City and reclaim stolen wealth from them in the name of the legions of their victims. Well, is this really a good idea? And what do you think the outcome of such an event would be?
Well, it's not only a good idea, it's a necessary one under international law. You see, you're obligated, like I say, as a citizen, not to fund genocide. If there's one thing that came out of World War II that was necessary, good, was that the whole notion in the Nuremberg trials that citizens do not have to obey their governments anymore. When they're ordered to do a crime of any kind, they can say no. And they can be supported in that by international law, even if they're intimidated by in jail by their own governments. They're in the right under international law. Well, every time we pay taxes, every time you allow taxes to be deferred from the churches, you're contributing to a crime against humanity. It's been proven these churches committed these crimes. There's they even have this tradition in England and America. They call it a necessity defense, where if the authorities are breaking the law, you as a citizen can ignore their laws and do what you think is necessary. For example, performing citizen's arrests on somebody who you know is harming a child. We have to do that under moral and international law. We have to say no and take back wealth taken in our name that is being used. The wealth in the church is being used to cover up crimes, to facilitate child trafficking, to protect child rapists. That is being done in our name. And we are simply saying by that, no more. We are taking,
I'm sorry. I totally agree with you with saying no and to stop funding these evil atrocities that are going on. But to say no and not comply and not do any of that is one thing. But to use force and to take wealth, couldn't that be seen to be creating war?
Well, again, when we say occupy these churches and take it back, we're talking about nonviolent action because there's no need for violence. We have the truth on our side, we have the international law on our side, and we frankly have the majority of people on our side. Every time we hold a protest, we get incredible help and support from people, including cops. And because people know, that the emperor doesn't have any clothes. And so, for example, when we say take this wealth back, we're going to go into the churches. We're going to talk to the people there, tell them not to fund these churches anymore. Say, see the money in the collection plate. We think it should go to the people outside. We should think you should invite the homeless in like Jesus said to, and transform these places into actual places where the gospel is practiced and not, the protection of their wealth. And we believe that they will comply. In many cases, we're appealing to the hearts and minds of the people in the church, the police, everybody. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a reclamation, a reclaiming of the earth and this wealth. And it doesn't have to at all be forceful. In fact, anybody who comes in there advocating violence or force, we believe will be working for the church or the government to try to give a justification for our arrest. No, we're going to have this well-trained, well-organized so that it's a nonviolent action. But it's a very revolutionary action because it's reclaiming what's been taken from all of us.
This is one thing within the teachings of Christ. We can't truly own anything on this planet. So to take what is perceived as wealth from another, fundamentally, it doesn't resonate with me to be a good thing.
It's kind of an interim step. I know what you're saying. We're taking it so that it can be shared collectively. Right now it's held in private hands. Those private hands are not going to surrender it willingly. The question then is, in a time like this, when there's so much suffering and they're sitting on so much wealth, what do? You can make moral appeals, and, moral appeals with the church don't work. I've gone through bitter experience of that over 20 years. And the only thing they understand is a threat to their wealth. And taking that and holding it collectively, as the early Christians did. In Acts, they describe how all things were held in common by the early disciples. That's the kind of system we'd like to see. So eventually, it's about getting rid of wealth through that means, not taking it from one group and so another can have it. That's certainly not what we have in mind.
So what do you think the best outcome would be from this sort of campaign on the 24th of March? And then on the flip side, what do you think the worst outcome could be?
Well, the best outcome is simply to do what we all hope for, which is to have a system where the Gospels are actually being practiced, where the church as an institution is not a law unto itself, where those who harm people, and especially children, can be held to account and stop from ever doing it again. But like I say, that's part of a whole longer-term process of transformation that we're all involved with on many different fronts, many different issues. But with a common vision, we need to be united in that vision of reclaiming the earth. And the worst outcome, I don't think there is a worst. I mean, because frankly, when these things have started in the past, when you open hearts and minds, positive change is happening. There can be setbacks. I mean, we've gone through that. People have been killed over this. People fall, native line have been killed. There will be a cost. There's always a great cost when you're taking this on, but you have to always be aware at all times what's at stake. And I think that's what keeps us going.
Well, there's been a lot of lives lost through the name of religion, really, or in the name of religion. And I don't think that's what religion was supposed to have been about. And if many people rose up against the Catholic Church, which it is an evil institution, these guys heavily involved with secret societies and other institutes, big pharma, the military, and all that kind of stuff. Don't you think if it got to a certain stage and have got, like, as you say, was it 50 billion a year they make just from collections?
Something like that, yeah.
So with all that kind of wealth just from 1 year, and they've been doing this for hundreds of years, thousands, don't you think if it got to a certain stage they would bring in the military, as they do work hand in hand?
They could try that. But these are like all possibilities, and the thing to understand is that we are talking about ultimately not assaulting the church. We're talking about ignoring it, coming out from it, letting it fall by its own weight and inertia. Enough people do that, just like enough soldiers are appealed to in the military, and they come over. That's how revolutions happen, when the armed forces come over to the side of the revolution. This is what we're appealing to all the time. It works. We've seen police walk away when we tell them that they should not be standing there protecting these churches when they're trafficking children and hiding the graves of children they've killed in Indian schools. The police look down, they look away, and they don't intervene at that point. We can reach the hearts and minds of people with this, and that's what we plan to do and are doing all the time. But ultimately, I know your concern. We're not to talk about launching a war. We're talking about pulling, like they say in the Bible, come out from them and be separate. Don't be part of this evil institution anymore. And that's ultimately where we're heading.
Yeah, I'm not on about you guys launching a war, because there's many people out there that do things with a good intent, but it's these people that are pulling the strings on humanity for many, many years, and they can see what's going on. And are they going to pull the strings, or have they already written it and they can see this rebellion happening? And then if people rise up in such a fashion, could they not manipulate that and then bring in or take away more rights from people, or perceived rights, I should say, and even bring in martial law and enforce the New World Order's plan more?
Well, they're under right now, and the extent to which we give that our fear and concern, they have more power. But the reality is rights aren't given to us. They're inherent. They exist by us practicing them. And the more we practice and the weaker they are, the more we stand in that light, the less power they have. And there's that kind of whole dialectical relationship between them and us. We can't give them that energy and power. We have to say to them, we are on the moral high ground here. And yes, they can come in and start killing and locking people up, but that's a sign of weakness ultimately, and no state can sustain itself that way. They have to have legitimacy in the minds of the public, and when that legitimacy goes, they fall.
Aren't rights a little bit illusionary, and they're created by the state, the church, the bar, the legal system, the bank, because it seems to me that they create these rights and give them to people and take them away whenever they want.
That's the Roman notion of law. We have that in Canada under the Napoleonic Code system. What came from Roman and Canada law says the sovereign dictates the rights that the citizenry have. They can take them away through statute. Common law says the opposite, and that's in the Declaration of Independence in America. It's in the Saxon tradition in Europe that said law does harm to no one. People are born with inherent liberties that no government can take away. So the only way those inherent liberties exist is by them being practiced again and again and again. That's what creates rights. They're not given to us by an order by anybody. They're there, and nobody can alienate them from us. And that's the whole point we have to keep teaching people.
Well, I know that there's a guy on this called Vinny, and he does a thing, No State Project, and he heavily looks at rights. And the thing is, with the legal system, they create this body of rules, and they tell us we're policed by consent, and they say we have a certain amount of rights, but it just seems illusionary. And if you go into a court and claim that you have these rights, they just take them from you and enslave you even more. And the thing is, you've got in England, you've got magistrates, Crown Court, High Court, and when it goes to a High Court, this is where it becomes case law and is set as precedent. And if things go into a High Court, let's take for example 9/11. After 9/11, how many rights were taken off of people because of that false flag attack? Now, every false flag attack that they do, or everything that they manipulate and control, is taking people or rights away from people, or what they think are their perceived rights. And this is what I worry about for other people, not myself, because I'm nothing to do with that system anymore. I can operate outside of that as much as I possibly can. And other people don't know how this legal system enslaves them or how this body of rules work. So they'll go and fight tooth and nail for their freedom when what they're doing is making it harder for themselves and generations after them.
Okay, well, let me just ask a question. What do you mean by taking away somebody's rights?
Well, let's say there's a body of rights written out, but in law. Then what they done was there was Section 44 of the Terrorism Act, which said you couldn't film certain areas and the rest of it, and that was put there because of terrorism. You know what I mean? You can't film this, you can't film that. But they had to repeal that because the thing is, there's cameras everywhere. What you're telling me, tourists are not allowed to have cameras in the city of London anymore and things like that. So that was one they had to repeal very quickly. Otherwise, people would have just been arrested for taking a photograph of St. Paul's when it's already on Google Street View.
No, but what I meant is there's no such thing like when a government says here is a right. That's nothing. That's an illusion. If you believe what they've said, you're trapped in their system. You don't recognize. I mean, you see, it's a system of mental slavery. To have one elite say to you, here is what you can do and can't do. And if you say, oh, okay, here's what I can do and can't do, then you're trapped. But if you say, no, if that doesn't square with my inherent rights, I don't have to obey that. And they know that, which is why they need you in their jurisdiction. Because when you stand outside their jurisdiction and say, as long as we're not harming anybody, you do not have authority over me unless I grant consent to that. But consent has to be granted without coercion and in a knowledgeable way, aware of all the circumstances. None of the laws they bring in are consensual based because they don't inform people about their nature. They do it with a hammer over your head, that if you don't obey this law, you're going to go to jail. That's coercion, and it's an act of fraud. And fraud under common law, read it in Magna Carta, it says fraud mitigates all action. That is, if a government is bringing in a law in a fraudulent basis, that is, without telling you why they're really doing it, it's an illegitimate law. It doesn't have any standing. So these laws are fraudulent, primarily.
But the Magna Carta was signed by King John with a group of barons, and he was under knife point, and they made him sign it. Is that correct?
Well, that's part of the myth. I mean, like whether or not that actually happened. Basically, there was a whole political struggle going on between the Pope and the King at that point, because King John was broke. He needed money, and the Pope said, "Okay, I'll bail you out, but you got to put the whole country under my authority." So I mean, it was more complicated than that. And the thing about Magna Carta too is that for the first time, it said that the king's power is not absolute, and people have the right to be judged according to due process, judged by their peers, not by some turkey in Rome in a robe, or by a king on a throne. And so that idea, take it seriously, means as long as we're not harming anyone, if we don't give knowledgeable consent to the law, it has no authority or binding power over us.
And if we go back further in this conversation and in law as well, because you stated earlier about the Treaty of Verona. Now, that's a very interesting bit that you brought up, because I've heard things about the Treaty of Verona, and within that it stated that the Pope handed over the land known as England, the UK, to the Crown, for the Crown to hold it in trust for the people, and the Crown is holding it in trust until a competent heir from God comes back. Is that correct?
Well, these elites always justify their action by referring to heaven, by referring to, well, you don't know how to operate this, guys. We're going to have to do it for you. I mean, it's part of the old elite thinking. The thing about holding something in trust, the same thing is done here in Canada. We stole all of the native land, and now we say we're holding it in trust for them. The Crown holds native land in trust. It just means we've stolen it, and you can't do anything about it. It doesn't have any standing under the law to steal something from someone and then say, we'll give it back to you when we think you're competent. That's all fraud. This is what people have to wake up to.
But that's the whole thing about the trust. If they're holding it in trust, they're not claiming to own it. They're holding it in trust and allegedly letting us be the beneficiaries. But the way I see it is we are the beneficiaries of their system of slavery.
We are born into the world with equal access to the lands and resources. Somehow, a small elite grab that for themselves and say, we know better. We need to own this for you. I mean, it's part of the slave master mentality that comes really from Rome.
Oh, it's just a crazy world that we're living in here. And if it does state that in the Treaty of Verona, that they are holding it in trust until a competent heir from God comes back, what do you think that they would say if somebody stood there in a courtroom, brought up the Treaty of Verona and claimed to be a child of God?
Well, it's kind of like what happened if Jesus came back. He'd probably last about 5 minutes and the church would crucify him. The same thing. You'd be declared non compos mentis by the judge, by the court psychiatrist, and put away in a loony bin. That's how they maintain their power.
Yeah, it's like I was inside St. Paul's one day, and I had a very great conversation in there with one of the vergers. And I used to like going in there and having good conversations with these guys. The conversation was at the end of the conversation, he came up to me and he said, we're closing soon. And I said, are you telling me there's business hours? Could you imagine if I turned over them tables and started throwing you out? But I don't want to be labelled now, do I? And that's the funny thing. If anybody did read these Bibles and took it word for word for how it is, and I see the King James as a rule book. There's Jesus in court was an amazing story in front of Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate is trying to get jurisdiction over him and saying to him, are you Jesus, King of the Jews? And he just quite simply said to him, is that what they call me? He didn't make any claims. He didn't claim the name. But did they listen to him? No, he had to wash his hands of it, and they still crucified him. So on the 24th of March, what is the actual plan of action?
Well, we're nonviolent actions in and around churches all over the world in 10 countries. There's going to be all sorts of teach-ins happening that week, educating people about what we're doing, calling on people in the church to voluntarily leave the church or stop giving money. It's going to be many levels of education and action. And there'll be more postings about that at ITCCS.org over the next few weeks. We're also sending out instructions to teams of people who want to actually be involved in doing those events. And, you know, like you pointed out today, there's questions that need to be talked about. Nobody has a final answer on this. We're just opening up a new front here. You know, so it's exciting. We're creating something new here, and we're not claiming to have the final word on any of this. But we just invite people to be part of it.
Well, I think I'm definitely going to go down and pop my head into St. Paul's Cathedral this week and ask a few questions the way I usually do. Because this is really interesting, why the Pope's quit, what's going on in the world. The banking system is collapsing. I think it's orchestrated to collapse. And the elites, they know this is happening, and they want to manipulate and control every angle of it, even through a collapse. So I can only find solutions for myself and don't pretend to offer anyone else solutions. But I do hope that we can get rid of this criminal elite and try and find some freedom for humanity, because I think that connection from humanity has been taken away from us by so many things, whether it be the corporate world or sorry to say, I think religion controls people. Anything that's built upon fear controls people.
Exactly. And, you know, a quick reading of what Jesus was saying is you got to let fear go. Stand in love, stand in truth, and you're unbeatable. And I've had a lot of examples of that in my own life and with the people I work with. So I really believe in that. And we just have to turn that belief into action. And, you know, it'll be all right. We'll stay in touch. I'm curious what they say at St. Paul's.
Yeah, for sure. For sure, we'll keep in touch. Well, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left at the moment, Kevin. So, like, is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't topped off on, or would you like to refresh on anything?
Just, again, to remind people, ITCCS.org, there'll be updates about what happens in Rome, what we're doing all over the world, and also our common law court. Please, again, go to the November 30th and November 6th and January 30th postings at ITCCS.org. That's our complete case with 150 exhibits showing that church and state in Canada planned the extermination of whole areas of the country of Native children deliberately. That case, like I say, is being sent to other courts. It's up online. There'll be a verdict coming down over the next little while from our citizen jurors, and we'll be posting that verdict and how we intend to enforce it. So that's important to follow. And also, just so people know, I'm coming to Europe in June. I'll be giving talks and working with these groups all over Europe. I've been to England quite a number of times and enjoyed the pleasure of one of Her Majesty's immigration jails, 24 hours. So I look forward to being there again and meeting all of you.
Well, they seem to play about with me a lot, the Queen's Guards, and I like to play with them too. And I don't mean them any harm. I love all of them, because the people that are causing all this harm and corruption around the world, these are the ones that we have to truly resonate love towards, because they're only going to keep attacking and keep putting their fear out to control people. But on one last note, because we've got Santos Bonacci coming in on the hour, and I don't know if you know of Santos Bonacci?
Sure do. I work with Santos.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant. So I can't wait for that. That's going to be a brilliant interview. And what do you think about astrotheology and the connection to the church?
Well, I haven't read too much about it, so I can't really say. But, you know, being a minister and working with this over the years, I'm open to any possibility, you know. I think we're dealing with 90% of the universe is not visible to our senses. And, So I think that there's a lot of mystery here that we don't understand. Real reason behind things we have to continually be probing. So that sounds intriguing. I hope we can maybe do another show sometime and talk about it.
Yeah, sure. Well, we'll have to book it a little bit more in advance this time because, like, I thought, right, I've been trying to get hold of you, and I wanted you on, and an hour will do. I think we got through so much information on that hour. But the one last thing that I want to top off is the canon law. What was the Latin that you stated, that the canon law of Ratzinger's writing in to cover up paedophilia?
So it's heard the crime solicitation, which in Latin is crimen, and then I think it's spelled solicitationis or something like that. I can't pronounce it. I'm not good on Latin, but you can find
it on your website.
hiddennolonger.com. Go to one of the appendices. It's reprinted in full, and look at paragraph 11, and it's all there. And just a final note too. If people want to get a hold of me, my email is hiddenfromhistory1@gmail.com.
Okay, brilliant. We may as well wrap that up for tonight with Kevin. And coming up after a couple of tunes, I'm going to sort Santos Bonacci out and I'll bring him in.